The rain began falling over the Whitmore estate at 11:22 in the evening. By midnight, there were 6 ambulances and 4 black sedans parked along the circular driveway. The iron gate stayed open. The security guards did not check any identification. They just waved everyone through because the man inside the mansion was dying and no one knew why. On the second floor, the master bedroom had become a battlefield of white coats and medical equipment. The room was enormous. 15-foot ceilings, a crystal chandelier, a Monet painting on the far wall. It was the kind of room that made people lower their voices, but tonight no one was quiet. Tonight, the room was filled with arguments and beeping monitors and the sound of Edward Whitmore struggling to breathe. He lay on his king-size bed with silk sheets. His face was the color of old newspaper. His breath came in short, desperate gasps. His hands trembled on top of the sheets. These were the hands that had signed billion-dollar deals. They had shaken the hands of 3 presidents. They had built an empire spanning 18 countries. Now, they could not hold a glass of water. 20 doctors surrounded the bed. Cardiologists from Johns Hopkins, neurologists from Mayo Clinic, toxicologists from Stanford. The best minds in American medicine standing shoulder to shoulder. They had monitors and IV drips and a crash cart ready near the door. They had decades of combined experience and a lifetime of framed diplomas between them. And still, none of them could answer the single question that mattered in this room. What was killing Edward Whitmore? One doctor said it was a massive heart attack. Another argued it was a brainstem stroke. A third was convinced it was a rare infection from one of Edward's recent trips to Southeast Asia. The arguments grew louder. The monitors beeped faster. Edward closed his eyes and his pulse dropped to 41, then 40, then 38. Dr. Nathaniel Pierce stood at the foot of the bed with his arms crossed, 61 years old, silver hair, Oxford educated. He had been Edward's personal physician for 14 years. He knew every medication Edward took and every condition in his chart. He knew the name of Edward's first dog. He knew the year Edward had his appendix removed. He knew the layout of every Whitmore property across 4 continents because Edward flew him everywhere. But tonight, Dr. Pierce did not know what was killing his patient, and he could not accept that. "Run the toxicology panel again," he said. His voice was calm, but his hands were not. "Start broad-spectrum antibiotics. Get me a list of everything he has consumed in the last 24 hours. Every meal, every drink, every supplement. I want it all within the hour." Outside the bedroom door, Victoria Whitmore paced the marble hallway. She was the eldest daughter, 42 years old, sharp cheekbones and sharper ambition. Her heels clicked against the floor like a clock counting down to something irreversible. She had flown in from New York 2 hours ago and had not taken off her coat. "You are the best doctors in the country," Victoria said to Pierce when he stepped out. "Why does no one know what is wrong with my father?" "We are doing everything possible. These things take time. We have already ruled out several possibilities." "We do not have time. Look at him. He is dying. You are 20 doctors. He is 1 patient. How is this so difficult?" "I understand your frustration, but panicking will not help him." "I am not panicking, Dr. Pierce. I am asking a very simple question. Why can 20 doctors not diagnose what is happening to my father?" Pierce had no answer. He returned to the bedroom and closed the door. Next to Victoria stood her younger brother Charles, 37 years old, pale face, hands buried deep in his pockets. He had been in the house for 3 hours and had not spoken a single word. He just stared at the bedroom door as if waiting for someone to walk out and tell him all of this was an elaborate misunderstanding. And near the staircase, Eleanor Whitmore stood with her arms wrapped around herself. The second daughter. She had been estranged from the family for 6 years. She flew in from Boston tonight without packing a bag. Her eyes were red, but she was not crying. She just stood there in the same hallway as her siblings, and the distance between them was more than physical. Victoria saw her, and her jaw tightened. "Who called you?" "Charles texted me." Charles had no right. He has every right. He is our father too. He is my father. You stopped being part of this family 6 years ago, Eleanor. You made that choice very clear. Eleanor did not answer. She looked at the bedroom door. The silence between the three of them was heavier than any words. There was no time for old wounds, but the wounds were there anyway. Inside the bedroom, a woman stood perfectly still in the corner near the window. Her name was Clara Maid Johnson. She was 48 years old, strong shoulders from a lifetime of physical work, deep brown skin, dark eyes that missed nothing. She wore the gray uniform of the household staff. In her hands, she held a damp cleaning cloth. There was rainwater on her shoulders because she had run outside in the storm to guide the paramedics through the service entrance when the main hallway was blocked by antique furniture Victoria had ordered moved that morning. 12 years. Clara had worked in this mansion for 12 years. She knew the sound of every floorboard and which ones creaked in winter. She knew Edward always drank water at 9:30 in the evening. No ice, not too cold. She knew he never ate seafood after 7 because it gave him indigestion. She knew his favorite chair faced east. She knew he read the Wall Street Journal before the New York Times every morning. She knew the flowers in his bedroom were supposed to be changed every Tuesday by a florist named Martin, who had been serving the Whitmore family for 15 years. But tonight, the flowers were not from Martin. White lilies in a crystal vase near the window. Beautiful. Fragrant. The petals were still fresh and white as bone. Someone had placed them carefully, arranged them with intention. But Edward Whitmore was allergic to lily pollen. His throat would close. His eyes would water and swell. Everyone who worked in the house knew this. It was written in the household manual on page 4. It was discussed at every staff meeting. The florist Martin knew it. The head housekeeper knew it. Clara most certainly knew it. And yet the lilies were there. Clara had noticed them at 7 o'clock when she came in to turn down the bed. She mentioned it to the head housekeeper. The head housekeeper said Victoria must have brought them as a gift and not known about the allergy. Clara let it go at the time. It was not her place to question Victoria Whitmore. But now Edward was dying, and Clara could not stop looking at the lilies. She had noticed other things throughout the evening, small details that did not add up. At 8:30, when she brought Edward his evening tea, she saw a small red mark on his wrist, just beneath the cuff of his pajama sleeve. It looked like a needle mark, small, precise. Not a scratch from a rose bush or a scrape from bumping into furniture, a puncture mark. Clara asked Edward about it. He glanced down at his wrist and shrugged. Probably a spider, he said. I felt something earlier. But Clara had never seen a spider in the master bedroom. Not once in 12 years. The pest control service came every month. Mrs. Whitmore was terrified of insects. Clara had also noticed a faint chemical smell in Edward's evening tea. Not the usual bergamot. Something underneath it, sharp, unnatural, metallic. She almost said something as she poured the tea, but Edward was already drinking it and he seemed perfectly fine. She told herself she was imagining things. She told herself the stress of the day was getting to her. And she had noticed the glass of water on the nightstand, still half full. At the bottom, a thin, cloudy residue that did not come from water. It swirled when she moved the glass gently. It clung to the sides like a secret that wanted to be seen. She stood in her corner now and watched the doctors argue. She watched Dr. Pierce check his phone while his patient's pulse kept dropping. She watched Victoria Whitmore pace and Charles Whitmore stare blankly, and Eleanor Whitmore grip the staircase railing until her knuckles turned white. And in her mind, she traveled back 23 years to a place very far from Connecticut, Lagos, Nigeria. Her first month as a nurse at the General Hospital. The hospital was underfunded and overcrowded. The doctors did the best they could, but often the best was not enough. Patients died from conditions that would have been treatable in any Western hospital. Clara learned fast because she had no choice. She learned to trust her eyes more than the charts because the charts were often incomplete. She learned that sometimes the most important information came not from tests but from careful observation. One night, a patient arrived with symptoms no one could diagnose: gray skin, irregular breathing, a pulse that kept collapsing. The doctors were baffled. They ran every test available. They consulted every textbook. They argued among themselves for hours while the patient slipped further away. An old nurse named Mama Ifioma pulled Clara aside. She was the oldest nurse in the hospital. No one knew exactly how old she was. Some said 70, some said 80. She had been practicing medicine before Nigeria gained independence. She had delivered babies in villages with no electricity. She had treated infections with remedies that were older than hospitals. She knew things that were not written in any textbook and never would be. "Look at his eyes, child," Mama Ifoma said to Clara. "That is not a stroke. That is not a heart attack. That is something from the old villages. The alkaloid from the seeds of the climbing lily. Gloriosa superba. Very rare, very deliberate. Someone put this in his food." Clara had never heard of it. How do you test for something like that? You do not need a laboratory, child. You need household bleach. A few drops. Mix it with whatever liquid the patient consumed. If it turns purple, the alkaloid is present. The color change is unmistakable. It takes less than 30 seconds. "How do you know this, Mama Ifoma?" The old nurse's eyes went distant for a moment. "Because I have seen it before, child. Twice in 50 years. Both times the patient died before anyone believed me. Do not let this one be the third." They did the test. The liquid turned purple. Mama Ifioma was right. But by the time they identified the toxin, the patient was too far gone. He died at 4 in the morning. Clara never forgot the exact shade of that purple. She never forgot the feeling of knowing the answer and being too late to do anything about it. And now, here she was, in a mansion in Connecticut, 20 doctors in the room, a billionaire dying in front of her, and the same purple waiting at the bottom of a water glass. She looked at the glass. She looked at Edward. His pulse was 34 now. His breathing was barely visible. The doctors were still arguing about whether to intubate him. Victoria was still pacing. Pierce was on his phone again, and Clara could see he was not looking at medical results. He was looking at his email. She took one step forward. "Excuse me, Dr. Pierce." Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise in the room like a blade through silk. "Doctor." Pierce looked up from his phone. Surprise crossed his face. Then the surprise became irritation. "Not now, Mrs. Johnson. We are in the middle of a medical emergency. Please wait outside with the family." Clara did not move. She had been invisible in this house for 12 years. That was part of the job. Clean the rooms before sunrise. Disappear before the family wakes up. Speak only when spoken to. She was excellent at being invisible, but she was not invisible tonight. Not when a man was dying. Not when she knew something that every doctor in this room did not. "I think you are all looking at the wrong things," she said. The room went completely silent. Every single doctor turned toward the woman in the gray uniform with her damp cloth and her quiet voice and her dark eyes that had seen death before. Victoria Whitmore stepped into the doorway. Her face was stone. Her eyes swept over Clara's wet uniform and her cleaning cloth and her rain-soaked shoulders. "You are the housekeeper. What could you possibly know about medicine? You clean floors for a living. You change bed sheets. That is your job. Do not interfere with doctors who are trying to save my father." Clara looked at Victoria. She looked at the 20 doctors in the room. She looked at Edward Whitmore, whose chest was barely rising. Then she looked back at Victoria and spoke clearly. "I know this room. I know the flowers in that vase are wrong. Edward is allergic to lily pollen. Everyone who works in this house knows that. You know it too, Victoria. And yet those lilies have been sitting there since this afternoon. I know there is a mark on his wrist that was not there yesterday. A needle mark, small and precise. I asked him about it, and he said it was probably a spider. But I have never seen a spider in this room in 12 years. I know there is a smell in his tea that should not be there. Something chemical. Something underneath the bergamot. And I know there is something in that glass of water on the nightstand. Residue at the bottom. It has been there for hours." One of the cardiologists laughed. A short, dismissive sound. Are we genuinely taking medical advice from the maid now? She cleans the bathroom and suddenly she is a diagnostician. Please, someone escort her out. Dr. Pierce stepped toward Clara. His jaw was tight. Mrs. Johnson, I do appreciate your concern. Truly, I do. But you need to let us do our work. We are running every test available. The toxicology panel will be back in less than 40 minutes. There is nothing you can do here. Please go downstairs with the other staff. Then the heart monitor flatlined. A single, long, continuous tone. 3 full seconds. The line went flat on the screen. Edward Whitmore's chest stopped rising. His hands stopped trembling. They lay completely still on the silk sheets. In those 3 seconds, Clara May Johnson walked past Dr. Nathaniel Pierce. She walked past the cardiologist from Johns Hopkins, who had just laughed at her. She walked to the nightstand and picked up the half-full glass of water and held it up to the light. The residue swirled at the bottom. Cloudy. Waiting. I need bleach, she said. No one moved. Every doctor stood frozen. Victoria stood frozen in the doorway. Pierce's mouth opened, but no words came out. Household bleach, Clara said again. Her voice was no longer quiet. It filled the room the way the flatline tone had filled it a moment ago. Now, someone get me bleach right now. 3 seconds of flatline. That was all it took for Clara May Johnson to stop being invisible. The cardiologist from Johns Hopkins who had laughed at her 30 seconds ago was not laughing now. His face had gone pale. His hand was frozen halfway to the defibrillator paddles. Dr. Nathaniel Pierce stood motionless at the foot of the bed. His mouth was slightly open. Victoria Whitmore gripped the doorframe. Her knuckles were white against the dark wood. Clara repeated herself. Household bleach, the kind you keep under the kitchen sink. Someone needs to go get it right now. One of the younger residents near the door broke first. He turned and sprinted down the hallway. His footsteps echoed against the marble floors. Everyone else in the room stayed frozen. They watched Clara hold the water glass up to the light like it contained the answer to a question no one had asked. Dr. Pierce found his voice. Mrs. Johnson, what exactly are you doing? If there is a substance in that water, it needs to go to the laboratory for proper chain of custody analysis. This is how evidence works. By the time your laboratory returns results, Edward Whitmore will be dead, Clara said. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. I have seen this before, Dr. Pierce. 23 years ago in Lagos, Nigeria, the alkaloid from the seeds of the climbing lily, Gloriosa superba. It enters the bloodstream and mimics the symptoms of a heart attack combined with a brainstem stroke. The patient turns gray. The pulse collapses. The breathing becomes shallow and irregular. And unless treatment begins within hours, every organ shuts down, one by one, in sequence. There is no second chance. Pierce stared at her. His Oxford education was visibly wrestling with the image of a housekeeper diagnosing a rare poisoning in his patient. Gloriosa superba. You are telling me you believe a billionaire in Connecticut was poisoned with an obscure African plant toxin that most medical textbooks do not even mention. I am telling you that I have seen the exact same symptoms before in a hospital ward in Lagos. I am telling you the flowers in this room are wrong. I am telling you there is a needle mark on his wrist, and residue in his water glass, and a chemical smell in his evening tea. And I am telling you that if I am right, and we stand here debating my credentials for another 5 minutes, he dies. She looked directly into Pierce's eyes. If I am wrong, you have lost a glass of water and a cap full of bleach. So tell me, Dr. Pierce, which is the bigger risk right now? Pierce said nothing. The resident returned. He was breathing hard from the sprint. In his hand was a white plastic bottle of Clorox. He held it out to Clara as if she were the attending physician and he was asking for her approval. She took the bottle without ceremony and unscrewed the cap. The sharp chemical smell of bleach filled the room, familiar and industrial. She poured a small amount into the water glass, just a few drops. Then she held the glass high so everyone could see it. The residue at the bottom began to move. It swirled through the water like a living organism responding to a stimulus. Then it started to change color, faint at first, a pale violet blush spreading outward from the center. Then deeper, more intense. Within 15 seconds, the entire glass was glowing with a deep, unmistakable purple. The exact shade Clara had seen once before in her entire life. 23 years ago in a hospital in Lagos. She had never forgotten it. She knew she never would. The room went completely silent. The monitors beeped, but no one heard them anymore. Every doctor in that room was staring at the purple glass in Clara May Johnson's hand. Dr. Pierce stepped forward and took the glass from her. His fingers were trembling. He held it up to the light himself and watched the purple swirl. "Colchicine," he whispered. Gloriosa superba seeds contain concentrated colchicine. It is a cellular toxin. It arrests mitosis at the metaphase stage. Multi-organ failure begins within 6 to 12 hours. Death within 24 hours without intervention. He looked at Clara. His expression had changed entirely. It was not irritation now. It was not surprise. It was shame. Deep and genuine shame. And we missed it. 20 physicians from the finest institutions in the country, and we all missed it. Every single one of us. "Then stop missing it and start treating him," Clara said. "He is still flatlining in case anyone has forgotten." That broke the spell. The room erupted into organized chaos. The cardiologist from Johns Hopkins grabbed the defibrillator paddles and pressed them to Edward's chest. Another doctor started a fresh IV line with a new set of medications. Dr. Pierce was on the phone with the toxicology center at Mount Sinai Hospital, barking orders about Fab fragment antibodies and aggressive supportive care protocols. The young resident who had fetched the bleach stood near the door looking like he had just witnessed something he would tell his grandchildren about someday. Clara stepped back into her corner near the window. Her part was finished. She had said what needed to be said. Now it was the doctor's turn to do what they were trained to do. She watched them work with the same quiet attention she had brought to this room every day for 12 years. The defibrillator charged. The paddles discharged. Edward Whitmore's body jerked on the silk sheets. The monitor beeped once, a pause that felt like an eternity. Then it beeped again. A rhythm returned, weak and irregular but unmistakably present. "Got him back," the cardiologist said. His voice was hoarse. "Pulse is 42 and climbing." Over the next hour, Edward Whitmore stabilized. His color returned slowly from the gray of old newspaper to something closer to living flesh. His breathing deepened and became more regular. His pulse climbed past 50 and kept going. The doctors administered activated charcoal through a nasogastric tube to bind whatever toxin remained in his digestive system. They started a continuous intravenous infusion of fluids and electrolyte replacement. They monitored his liver function and kidney output with the focused intensity of air traffic controllers guiding a crippled aircraft toward a runway. At 3 in the morning, Dr. Pierce stepped into the hallway. His face was exhausted. His silver hair was disheveled. His white coat was wrinkled from hours of standing and pacing and leaning over a dying man. The Whitmore siblings were still exactly where they had been. Victoria had not moved from her spot near the doorframe. Charles sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his knees pulled up to his chest. Eleanor stood at the top of the staircase in the exact position she had occupied since arriving from Boston. "Your father is going to survive," Pierce said. "We believe we have identified and neutralized the toxin. His vital signs are improving. Barring complications, he should make a full recovery." Victoria's eyes closed. For the first time all night, the iron tension in her shoulders released. Charles dropped his head into his hands, and his shoulders began to shake. Eleanor let out a breath that sounded like it had been held since the moment she got on the plane in Boston. No one spoke for a long moment. The relief was too raw to be put into words. Then Victoria opened her eyes. The relief was already gone. In its place was something cold and sharply focused. What was it? Colchicine poisoning, from the seeds of a plant called Gloriosa superba. How was it administered? 2 routes. Based on the evidence, your housekeeper identified there was an injection site on his wrist, which suggests a direct intravenous or subcutaneous dose. And there were traces of the alkaloid in his water glass, which suggests a secondary oral dose was added to his evening drink. Someone wanted to be absolutely certain he did not survive. Victoria's jaw tightened until the muscles stood out. Someone tried to murder my father tonight. Yes, this was not an accident. This was not a mistake. This was a deliberate and premeditated attempt on your father's life by someone who had direct access to his bedroom and detailed knowledge of his evening routine. Who? We do not know yet, but there are several anomalies that do not add up. The lilies in his room, the needle mark, the chemical odor in his tea. Someone was in that bedroom tonight. Someone who knew his schedule. Someone who understood exactly which flowers would not draw attention because they would be assumed to be a gift from you. Victoria turned toward the bedroom. Her eyes found Clara standing in her corner. The housekeeper's gray uniform was still damp from the storm. Her cleaning cloth was still in her hand. She looked exactly as she had looked at the beginning of the night. But nothing else about her position in this house was the same. "You," Victoria said. Her voice was different now. Not dismissive, not hostile, something closer to disbelief. "How did you know all of this? The lilies, the needle mark, the tea, the water, the bleach test. How does a housekeeper know something that 20 doctors did not?" Clara met Victoria's eyes without flinching. "I paid attention. That is the entire answer. I have been paying attention in this house for 12 years. I know the sound of Edward's breathing when he is sleeping, and I know the sound of his breathing when he is awake. I know which deliveries arrive on which days. I know which florist supplies the flowers and what time he comes. I know the names of every member of the household staff and their schedules and their routines. I know this room better than anyone except the man who sleeps in it. The flowers were wrong because Martin always uses blue wrapping paper with a white ribbon. These lilies had no wrapping paper at all. Someone placed them directly in the vase. Someone who knew exactly where the vase was. Someone who has been in this room before." Victoria stared at her. The silence stretched. Then Victoria Whitmore did something that no one in that hallway had ever seen her do. She walked across the marble floor and stopped directly in front of Clara May Johnson. She looked at the damp uniform and the cleaning cloth and the dark eyes that had seen what no one else had seen. "I owe you an apology," Victoria said. "What I said to you earlier was cruel, and it was beneath me. You saved my father's life tonight. My family owes you a debt that cannot be measured." Clara nodded once. Her expression did not change. "The debt is not to me. It is to a woman named Mama Ifeoma. She was the oldest nurse at the General Hospital in Lagos. No one knew exactly how old she was. Some said 70, some said 80. She had been practicing medicine before Nigeria was an independent nation. She delivered babies in villages with no running water and no electricity. She treated infections with remedies that were older than any hospital. She knew things that will never be written in any textbook. She was the one who taught me about the climbing lily and the bleach test. She was the one who knew. She spent 50 years watching patients die because doctors would not listen to an old woman from the villages." Clara paused. "Your father would have died tonight for the exact same reason. 20 doctors in this room with decades of training, and not one of them thought to ask the person who actually spends time in this room what she had noticed." The words landed in the silence like stones dropped into still water. Dr. Pierce looked at the floor. The cardiologist from Johns Hopkins rubbed the back of his neck and stared at the wall. The young resident who had brought the bleach stood very still near the staircase. Victoria Whitmore stood in front of Clara with nothing to say. The woman who had never been at a loss for words in her entire professional life had nothing to say. Pierce cleared his throat. "We need to call the police now. This is an attempted murder investigation. We need to secure the room. The water glass, the teacup, the lilies. Everything in this room is evidence. Nothing can be touched or moved until the forensic team arrives." Victoria nodded slowly. Make the call. I want every person who was on this property today accounted for. Every staff member, every visitor, every delivery driver. I want to know who brought those lilies. I want to know who had access to my father's bedroom. I want to know every single detail of every single person who crossed the gate. I can help with that, Clara said. Everyone turned to look at her. I know the household schedule. I know which delivery came at what time. I know who was in which room and for how long. And I know that the florist Martin Hirsch was not the only delivery to this house today. There was a second arrival at 4:30 in the afternoon. A courier van with no insignia. Dark blue. It stayed for less than 10 minutes. The driver was not one of the regular couriers. I noticed because he parked near the service entrance instead of the main gate like all regular deliveries do. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Did you see what he delivered? No, I was in the East Wing preparing the guest rooms, but I saw the van from the window, and I saw someone from inside the house walk out to meet him, someone who did not usually handle deliveries. Clara paused. Her dark eyes moved across the faces in the hallway. The head housekeeper, Margaret Chen. She walked out to the van herself. She never does that. The junior staff always handles courier deliveries. It is in the household manual, Section 6, Paragraph 4. Margaret wrote it herself. The silence that followed was different from the silences before. This one was charged, electric. Every person in that hallway understood what Clara was implying without her having to say it outright. Victoria turned to Pierce. Where is Margaret Chen right now? I do not know, Pierce said. I have not seen her since the ambulances arrived. Clara set her cleaning cloth down on the marble banister. Her movements were calm and deliberate. She was in the kitchen when I ran out to meet the paramedics. That was at 11:30. I have not seen her since I came back inside. Her car is a silver Toyota Camry. It is no longer in the staff parking area. I checked from the second-floor landing window while the doctors were working on Edward. Charles looked up from his spot on the floor. For the first time in 4 hours he spoke. His voice was rough from disuse. She ran. She is gone, Clara confirmed. And she had a key to every room in this house. The Greenwich Police Department arrived at the Whitmore estate at 4:15 in the morning. Detective Angela Rossi led the team, 47 years old, 22 years on the force. She had investigated domestic homicides and financial fraud and one kidnapping that made national headlines for 3 weeks. But she had never worked a case inside a mansion with a Monet on the wall and a billionaire fighting for his life upstairs. Rossi stood in the marble foyer and took everything in. The 20 doctors packing up their equipment, the 3 Whitmore siblings scattered across the hallway like survivors of a disaster. The crystal chandelier reflecting the blue and red lights from the police cruisers outside. And the woman in the gray housekeeping uniform standing near the staircase with a damp cloth still in her hand. I need the timeline, Rossi said. I need the names of every person who was on this property in the last 24 hours. Staff, family, visitors, deliveries, everyone. And I need to speak to whoever identified the poison. Every person in the hallway turned to look at Clara. Rossi followed their gaze. Her eyes moved from the gray uniform to the cleaning cloth to the dark eyes that had seen everything. You? Yes, Clara said. Walk me through it. From the beginning, leave nothing out. Clara told her everything. The lilies that were not from Martin the florist, the needle mark on Edward's wrist that looked too precise to be an accident, the chemical smell in his evening tea, the residue in the water glass, the bleach test she had learned from Mama Ifioma in a hospital ward in Lagos 23 years ago, the dark blue courier van that arrived at 4:30 in the afternoon and parked near the service entrance instead of the main gate, and the head housekeeper Margaret Chen who walked out to meet it herself against every protocol she had written into the household manual. Rossi wrote all of it down in a small black notebook. Her pen moved fast. When Clara finished, the detective closed the notebook and looked at her for a long moment. You were a nurse in Nigeria, 12 years at the General Hospital in Lagos. Why did you stop? Clara's expression did not change. My husband died. There was nothing left for me in Lagos after that. I came to the United States and took whatever work I could find. The Whitmore estate was hiring. I told them I had medical training, but they said they needed a housekeeper, not a nurse. So I became a housekeeper. And tonight you became a nurse again. Tonight I became someone who refused to watch a man die because of other people's pride. Rossi nodded slowly. She turned to Victoria. I need a complete list of your household staff, current and former, anyone who left in the last 6 months, anyone who was fired, anyone who had a grudge. Victoria had already prepared the list on her phone. She handed it to Rossi without a word. Her face was composed, but her hands were shaking very slightly. The detective noticed. Mrs. Whitmore, has anyone threatened your father recently? Business rivals, former partners, anyone with a reason to want him dead? Edward Whitmore has made enemies for 40 years. He built an empire from nothing. You cannot do that without making people angry. But a threat like this... Victoria stopped. She looked at the bedroom door. Someone wanted him to suffer. Colchicine poisoning is slow. It takes hours. The organs shut down one by one. This was not a quick bullet or a clean heart attack. Someone wanted him to feel every minute of it. Charles spoke from his spot against the wall. His voice was still hoarse. Margaret Chen has worked for us for 9 years. She came to every family Christmas party. She knew my children's names. She organized my mother's funeral reception. Why would she do this? Money, Victoria said. Everything comes down to money eventually. Someone offered her enough to betray 9 years of loyalty. Or someone had leverage, Rossi said. Money is one reason. Fear is another. We will find out which one it was. 2 uniformed officers finished photographing the master bedroom. The water glass and the teacup and the lilies were bagged and tagged as evidence. The needle mark on Edward's wrist was photographed under ultraviolet light. A forensic team dusted the nightstand and the doorframe and the windowsill for fingerprints. The dark blue courier van was already being traced through traffic cameras and Department of Motor Vehicles records. Rossi pulled Dr. Pierce aside near the staircase. Give me the medical perspective. How close did he come? Minutes, Pierce said, perhaps less. His pulse dropped to 34. Then it flatlined entirely for approximately 3 seconds. If Mrs. Johnson had not identified the toxin when she did, we would be having a very different conversation right now. The colchicine had already begun attacking his liver and kidneys. Another hour and the damage would have been irreversible. And none of your 20 doctors caught it. Pierce's jaw tightened. No, we did not. We were treating a heart attack and a brainstem stroke because those were the symptoms presenting. The underlying cause was something none of us had seen outside of a textbook. It was an extraordinary diagnostic leap. I have been practicing medicine for 37 years, and I do not know if I would have made that connection in time. It was not a diagnostic leap, Clara said from her spot near the staircase. She had been listening. It was observation. The doctors were looking at monitors and test results. They were not looking at the room. They were not looking at the flowers or the water glass or the mark on his wrist. They were treating data instead of treating the patient. She paused. Mama Ifioma used to say that a good doctor treats the disease. A great doctor treats the person. And the greatest doctor of all treats the room. Rossi looked at Clara for a long moment. Then she wrote something else in her notebook. At 5:30 in the morning, Detective Rossi received a phone call. She stepped into the library to take it. When she came back, her expression had changed. The traffic cameras picked up the courier van. Dark blue Ford Transit. No license plate on the front, which is a violation in Connecticut. It headed south on Interstate 95 toward New York City. We lost it near the Bronx. No registered owner under that description. The plates on the back were stolen from a vehicle in Newark 3 days ago. She paused. Whoever did this was a professional. This was planned. This was funded. And this was not Margaret Chen working alone. Victoria's face went very still. What are you saying? I am saying that Margaret Chen was a piece of this. An important piece, but still a piece. Someone hired the courier. Someone provided the toxin. Someone knew your father's medical history and his allergies and his schedule and his vulnerabilities. Someone knew exactly which flower would not draw attention because you would be assumed to have brought it as a gift. Rossi looked directly at Victoria. Someone very close to this family either ordered this or paid for it, or both. The words hung in the marble hallway like smoke. No one spoke. No one moved. The implication was too enormous to process all at once. Eleanor was the first to break the silence. She had been standing at the top of the staircase for nearly 6 hours. Her voice was thin and exhausted, but it carried down the stairs with perfect clarity. Victoria, Father changed his will 3 months ago. You told me about it at the time. You said he was restructuring the company and the estate planning had to be updated. Who benefits from the new will? Victoria did not answer immediately. Her face was unreadable, but something shifted behind her eyes. Something cold and calculating that had been dormant while her father was dying was now fully awake. The new will divides the company equally among the 3 of us. Charles, Eleanor, me. The previous will left 60% to me as the sitting CEO of Whitmore Industries. The new one leaves 33% to each sibling, with the remaining 1% allocated to the charitable foundation. She paused. Father believed the new structure would prevent infighting after his death. He wanted us to work together rather than compete. But if he died before the new will was finalized, Rossi said slowly, the old one still stands. Yes, Victoria said. The old will was still in effect. The new documents were scheduled to be signed next Tuesday. Charles stood up from his spot against the wall. His face had gone very pale. Victoria, you are the one who benefits from the old will. You are the one who gets 60%. You are the one who has been running the company for the last 4 years. You are the one who brought the lilies. Victoria turned to face her brother. Her expression was ice. I brought the lilies as a gift for Father because I was trying to be thoughtful. I had no idea he was allergic to lily pollen. No one ever told me. I have not lived in this house for 15 years, Charles. You are the one who still lives in the guest house on the property. You are the one who has access to everything and everyone. And you are the one who has been borrowing money from Father for the last 3 years to cover your gambling debts. Charles's face went from pale to red in less than a second. Those debts are settled. I paid him back every dollar. With what money, Charles? You have no job. You have never had a job. You live in Father's guest house and you collect an allowance like a teenager. Where did you get the money to pay him back? I sold the apartment in Manhattan. Mother left it to me. You know this. I know that apartment was worth $3 million and your debts were nearly 5. I know Father covered the difference, and I know you resented him for making you beg for it. The siblings stared at each other across the marble hallway. The air between them was jagged with years of unspoken resentments. Eleanor stood at the top of the staircase, watching her brother and sister accuse each other of trying to murder their father. Her face was exhausted and sad, and not at all surprised. This is why I left, Eleanor said quietly. This family has been rotting from the inside for 20 years. Money and power and secrets and lies. Every dinner was a negotiation. Every Christmas was a battle. Every conversation was a maneuver. She looked at Victoria and then at Charles. I do not know which one of you did this, but I know one of you is capable of it. And that is the most honest thing anyone has said in this house tonight. Detective Rossi stepped between the siblings before anyone could respond. Everyone needs to stop talking right now. I need to speak with each of you individually, in separate rooms, with your lawyers present if you choose. She turned to Clara. Including you, Mrs. Johnson. You have been in this house for 12 years. You know things about this family that no one else knows. I need to hear all of it. Clara nodded once. She had been expecting this. She had known from the moment the bleach turned purple that her quiet, invisible life in this mansion was over. As Rossi began organizing the interviews, Clara walked to the window at the end of the hallway. The rain had stopped. The first gray light of dawn was beginning to show over the treetops of Connecticut. 12 years of cleaning floors and changing bed sheets and being invisible. 12 years of knowing everything and saying nothing. The sun was coming up on a new kind of life, and Clara May Johnson was ready for it. She turned back from the window. "Detective Rossi, before you start the interviews, you should check Margaret Chen's personnel file, specifically her emergency contact information." "We already pulled her file," Rossi said. "Then you know her emergency contact is her sister, Linda Chen, who lives in Queens." "Yes, what the file does not tell you is that Linda Chen died of pancreatic cancer 4 years ago. Margaret took 2 weeks of bereavement leave. I covered her shifts. I went to the funeral." Clara paused. If Margaret kept her dead sister as her emergency contact, it was because she did not want anyone in this house to know who she was really connected to. And that means someone helped her set up this identity 9 years ago. Someone who has been planning for this longer than any of you want to think about. Detective Rossi stood very still in the marble hallway. The name Linda Chen hung in the air like the last note of a funeral hymn. "Her emergency contact has been dead for 4 years, Rossi repeated, "and no one in this house knew." "The Whitmore family does not pay attention to staff," Clara said. "We are furniture that breathes. We are hands that clean and feet that carry trays. We are not people with histories and families and dead sisters in Queens. We are invisible." She looked at Victoria. Margaret Chen understood this better than anyone. She built her entire life inside this family's blind spot. Rossi pulled out her phone and made a call. She spoke in a low voice near the library door. Clara could hear fragments. "Background check on Margaret Chen. Whitmore Estate, 9 years. Linda Chen, deceased 4 years. Cross-reference with Interpol." When Rossi returned, her face was harder than before. "We just ran Margaret Chen's social security number. It belongs to a Margaret Chen who died in a car accident in Sacramento, California 19 years ago. She was 6 years old. Whoever your head housekeeper really is, she has been living under a dead child's identity for nearly a decade." Rossi looked at Victoria. "You did a background check when you hired her." "Our security firm handles all staff vetting, Sterling Associates. They have been managing household security for the Whitmore family for over 20 years. I need the name of the specific agent who approved Margaret Chen's file." Victoria pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved across the screen. Then her face went completely still. The agent who signed off on Margaret Chen's background check was David Sterling, the founder of Sterling Associates. He died of a heart attack 8 years ago, 6 months after Margaret was hired. She looked up. He was the only one who touched her file. No one else at the firm handled it. No one else reviewed it. The file itself is still in the system, but all the original documents were archived and sealed after his death. "So someone planted a fake identity," Rossi said. "Someone bribed or compromised the founder of a private security firm to approve it. Then the founder died 6 months later under circumstances that may or may not have been natural. This operation was not a spur-of-the-moment plan. Someone spent serious money and serious patience to get a woman inside this house 9 years ago, and she has been waiting ever since." "What changed?" Eleanor said from the staircase. "If Margaret was planted 9 years ago, why did she wait until tonight to poison him? She has had access to his food and his drinks and his medications for nearly a decade. She could have done this on any night of any week of any year. Why now?" Rossi considered the question. She walked to the window and looked out at the gray dawn spreading across the Connecticut estate. The rain had stopped completely now. The first birds were beginning to sing in the oak trees lining the driveway. It was an ordinary morning making its quiet, ordinary arrival, and inside the mansion, nothing was ordinary at all. "The will," Rossi said. "The new will was going to be signed next Tuesday. That changed the equation. Under the old will, Victoria inherited 60% and effective control of Whitmore Industries. Under the new will, the power is split 3 ways. Neither Charles nor Eleanor controls anything on their own. But if Edward had died a week after signing the new will, the old will would have been irrelevant. The new structure would have been locked in." She turned back from the window. "But he did not die a week after signing. He almost died a week before signing. Whoever planned this wanted Edward dead under the terms of the old will. The old will serves someone more than the new one does." Every person in that hallway turned to look at Victoria Whitmore. Victoria did not flinch. "I know how this looks. I stand to gain more from the old will than anyone else in this family. I have been the public face of Whitmore Industries for 4 years. I have access to every part of this estate and every member of the staff. And I brought the lilies." She paused. "But if I were going to kill my father for 60% of the company, I would not announce my arrival by bringing the murder weapon into his bedroom and placing it directly next to his bed in full view of the household staff. I am not stupid." "She has a point," Eleanor said quietly. "Victoria makes many mistakes, but stupidity has never been one of them." "Then who?" Charles said. His voice was ragged. "If not Victoria, then who? Eleanor has been estranged from the family for 6 years. She has no access to the house and no relationship with the staff. And I have been living in the guest house for 3 years, barely speaking to Father outside of family dinners. Neither of us benefits from the old will more than the new one." Rossi looked at Clara. "You have been here for 12 years, Mrs. Johnson. You know this family better than they know themselves. What do you see that we are not seeing?" Clara was quiet for a long moment. She looked at Victoria standing rigid near the bedroom door. She looked at Charles slumped against the wall with his gambling debts and his borrowed money and his resentment. She looked at Eleanor at the top of the staircase, separated from her siblings by years of estrangement and a lifetime of wounds. And she thought about Margaret Chen, who had spent 9 years inside this mansion pretending to be someone she was not. "The person who benefits most from the old will is obvious," Clara said. "It is Victoria. Too obvious. The lilies in the bedroom, the timing of her visit, the knowledge that she would be the first person everyone suspected. A killer who wanted to frame Victoria would plan exactly this way." She paused. "But there is another possibility. Someone who benefits from the new will as much as the old one. Someone who wanted Edward dead regardless of which document was in effect at the time." "Who?" Victoria said. "Richard Ashworth." The name landed in the hallway like a hammer dropping onto glass. Every Whitmore sibling went completely still. Richard Ashworth was the chairman of Global Atlantic Airways. He had been Edward's rival for 30 years. The two men had built competing empires in adjacent industries, and their feud was legendary in business circles. 3 hostile takeover attempts, 2 antitrust investigations, 1 lawsuit that had dragged through the federal courts for 7 years and ended in a settlement that both sides claimed as a victory. Richard Ashworth had once told a reporter from the Wall Street Journal that Edward Whitmore was the only man in the world he genuinely despised. The quote was famous. It had been framed and hung in Edward's private study. "Why would Richard Ashworth want my father dead now?" Victoria said. "Their feud has been going on for 3 decades. Nothing has changed between them in the last 5 years." "Everything changed 6 months ago," Clara said, "when Global Atlantic Airways lost the Singapore route contract to Whitmore International. It was a $3 billion deal, the largest aviation services contract in Southeast Asian history. Richard Ashworth flew to Singapore personally to negotiate it. He spent 2 weeks there working every connection he had built over 40 years. And your father undercut him with a single phone call to the Prime Minister, who he had known since the man was a junior trade minister in 1998. "How do you know all of this?" Rossi asked. Clara met her eyes. "I clean the study every morning at 6 o'clock. Edward reads the financial news out loud to himself while he drinks his coffee. He talks to the newspaper. He argues with the columnists. He cheers when a rival loses a contract, and he mutters when a competitor gains ground. I have been listening to him talk to the Wall Street Journal for 12 years. I know more about his business dealings than half the people in his boardroom." Victoria stared at Clara. "You knew about the Singapore deal." "I knew about it the morning after it happened. Edward was so pleased he read the same article 3 times out loud. He said Richard Ashworth would never forgive this one. Those were his exact words. Richard Ashworth will never forgive this one." Rossi began writing in her notebook again. The pen moved fast. "If Ashworth is behind this, he would have the resources, private security firms, offshore accounts, connections to people who can create fake identities and plant operatives inside rival households. He also has the motive. $3 billion and a 30-year grudge is a lot of motive. But why attack now? Charles said. The Singapore deal was 6 months ago. If Ashworth wanted revenge, he could have acted at any point since then. Because the new will changed the equation, Clara said. Richard Ashworth does not just hate Edward Whitmore. He hates the Whitmore family. He wants the entire legacy destroyed. If Edward had died under the old will, Victoria would have inherited 60% and maintained control. The company would survive. The empire would continue. But if Edward had died under the new will, the family would have fractured. 3 siblings with equal shares and decades of resentment between them, the company would have torn itself apart within a year. Richard Ashworth would not just be killing a rival, he would be dismantling an entire dynasty. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds outside had stopped singing. Victoria Whitmore walked slowly to the window. The morning sun was climbing over the oak trees now. The estate looked peaceful and beautiful, and completely unaware that its foundations had just been shaken to the core. If Richard Ashworth is behind this, he will not stop, Victoria said. He has been waiting 30 years to destroy my father. He will try again. From a different direction, with a different plan. And we will not see it coming. We will see it, Clara said, because this time we are paying attention. Victoria turned from the window. She looked at Clara Maid Johnson standing in her gray housekeeping uniform, with her damp cloth and her dark eyes that had seen everything everyone else had missed. 12 years of invisibility had ended in a single night. The woman who cleaned the floors had become the woman who held the truth. You are no longer a housekeeper in this household, Victoria said. I want you working directly with Detective Rossi on this investigation. You know this house better than anyone. You know the staff better than anyone. And apparently, you know my father's business rivals better than I do. Whatever title you want and whatever salary you need, name it. Clara considered the offer. She had been invisible in this house for 12 years. She had cleaned the bathrooms and changed the bed sheets and listened to a billionaire talk to his newspaper while the world outside the windows moved on without her. She could have the title and the salary and the recognition. She could step out of the shadows and into the light. I want only one thing, Clara said. When this is finished, I want to find Margaret Chen's real family, whoever she was before she became Margaret Chen, whoever she left behind in her real life. Someone somewhere is missing her. Someone does not know what happened to the person she used to be. I want to find them and tell them the truth, whatever that truth turns out to be. Victoria nodded slowly. Done. I will commit whatever resources are necessary. Then I accept, Clara said. Detective Rossi closed her notebook. Margaret Chen is out there somewhere. She has a 9-year head start on building a backup identity, and she knows we are coming. The courier van disappeared near the Bronx, but that does not mean she stayed in New York. She could be anywhere by now, but she made one mistake. What mistake? Charles asked. She did not kill Edward Whitmore. She failed. And the person who hired her is going to be furious. Richard Ashworth did not spend 9 years planting an operative inside this house just to see his plan fall apart because one housekeeper knew how to test for colchicine with a cap full of bleach. Rossi looked at Clara. They are going to come after you, Mrs. Johnson. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but eventually. You are the reason their plan failed, and people like Richard Ashworth do not forgive failure. They do not forget the people who caused it. Clara met her eyes without blinking. Let them come. I have been invisible for 12 years, Detective Rossi. I have been silent while the world talked over me and around me and through me. I am not silent anymore. And I am not afraid of Richard Ashworth. I am not afraid of anyone who hides behind courier vans and fake names and poison in water glasses. Those are the weapons of cowards. She paused. A brave person looks you in the eye. A brave person tells you who they are and what they want and why they came. Richard Ashworth has never been brave. Not in 30 years of feuding with Edward Whitmore. and he is not brave now. The sun was fully up now. The birds had resumed singing. Somewhere in the kitchen, the morning staff was arriving for their shift, unaware that the world they had worked in yesterday no longer existed. The mansion was the same mansion it had been at midnight. The Monet was still on the wall. The chandelier still hung from the ceiling. The marble floors still reflected the light exactly as they always had. But nothing inside those walls was the same, and nothing ever would be again. Detective Rossi walked to the front door. She paused with her hand on the handle. "I am going to find Margaret Chen. I'm going to trace the courier van and the stolen plates and the fake identity and the dead security agent and every single thread that leads back to Richard Ashworth. But I need you to stay alive until I do." She looked at Clara. "All of you." The manhunt for Margaret Chen lasted 6 days. It ended in a diner parking lot outside Newark at 3 in the morning. Detective Rossi got the call while she was sitting in the Whitmore Library, surrounded by 9 years of household records. A patrol officer had run a routine plate check on a silver Toyota Camry outside an all-night diner near the airport. The plates were registered to a Margaret Chen of Greenwich, Connecticut. The officer had no idea the name was flagged in a multi-state investigation. He was just checking a car that had been parked in the same spot for 4 hours with its engine running. Rossi called Clara immediately. "We found her, Newark. She is just sitting in her car outside a diner, engine running, has been there for hours. I am on my way now." "I am coming with you," Clara said. "Mrs. Johnson, this is a police operation. You are a civilian. I am the civilian who knows what questions to ask her. You need me there, and you know it." Rossi was silent for 3 seconds. "Be outside in 5 minutes." The drive to Newark took 90 minutes through the empty highways of early morning Connecticut and New Jersey. Rossi drove. Clara sat in the passenger seat watching the lights of passing towns blur past the window. Neither woman spoke much. There was nothing left to say. 9 years of secrets were sitting in a silver Camry outside a diner, and every answer they had been chasing was inside that car. They arrived at 3:45 in the morning. The diner was a squat brick building with a neon sign that flickered on and off in the darkness. The parking lot was empty except for the silver Camry and 3 police cruisers arranged in a loose perimeter around it. Uniformed officers stood near their vehicles with hands resting on holstered weapons. No one had approached the car yet. They were waiting for Rossi. "Has she moved?" Rossi asked the lead patrol officer. "Has not moved. Has not responded to verbal commands. The engine is still running. We have not approached the vehicle directly, pending your arrival." Rossi nodded. She turned to Clara. "Stay behind me. Do not speak unless I tell you to. If anything goes wrong, you run toward the cruisers and do not look back. Understood?" "Understood." They walked toward the Camry together. Rossi's hand was on her weapon, but she did not draw it. Clara stayed 3 steps behind her as instructed. The parking lot was silent, except for the hum of the Camry's engine and the distant sound of trucks on the interstate. The diner's neon sign buzzed and flickered. The air smelled like rain and exhaust and old cooking oil. Rossi reached the driver's side window. She looked inside. Then she stopped. Margaret Chen was sitting in the driver's seat with both hands on the steering wheel. Her eyes were open. She was staring straight ahead through the windshield at the brick wall of the diner. She was not moving. She was not blinking. She had been dead for at least 3 hours. The cause of death was a single gunshot wound to the right temple. The weapon was still in her right hand. A small caliber revolver, the kind that fits easily into a purse or a glove compartment. The driver's side window was intact. The doors were locked. A clear suicide according to every visible indicator. Rossi stepped back from the window. Her face was hard and tired and not at all surprised. "Someone got to her before we did. Or she knew they were coming and decided to do it herself. Either way, the woman who could have told us everything is dead." Clara walked up to the passenger side window and looked inside. Margaret Chen's face was pale and still in the glow of the diner's neon sign. 9 years in the Whitmore mansion. 9 years of pretending to be someone she was not. 9 years of waiting for orders that finally came and then failing to execute them. Clara had expected to feel anger when she finally saw Margaret again. Instead, she felt something closer to pity. "The glove compartment," Clara said. "What about it?" "It is slightly open. Everything else in the car is perfectly organized. The seat position, the hands on the wheel, the weapon placement. But the glove compartment is open by about 2 inches. That is not the behavior of someone who is planning to die. That is the behavior of someone who wants something to be found." Rossi walked around to the passenger side and looked through the window. Clara was right. The glove compartment was slightly ajar. A small detail, but the kind of small detail that Clara Maid Johnson had built an entire life around noticing. They waited for the forensic team to arrive and process the scene. The Camry was photographed from every angle. The body was photographed. The weapon was photographed. Then, finally, a forensic technician in white gloves opened the passenger door and reached into the glove compartment. Inside was a single manila envelope, unsealed. No writing on the outside. The technician handed it to Rossi, who opened it carefully and removed the contents. 3 items: a handwritten letter addressed to no one, a USB drive, and a photograph of Margaret Chen standing next to a man in a dark suit at what appeared to be a charity gala. The man's face was visible and unmistakable: Richard Ashworth. Rossi read the letter aloud while Clara stood beside her in the parking lot. The handwriting was small and neat and perfectly controlled. The words of a woman who had spent 9 years inside another woman's life and was finally ready to tell someone who she really was. "My real name is not Margaret Chen. It is Anya Volkov. I was born in St. Petersburg 41 years ago. I came to the United States 20 years ago on a student visa, and I never went back. I was recruited by Richard Ashworth's organization 14 years ago. I was not a trained operative. I was a desperate immigrant, with no family in this country and no way to support myself. Ashworth's people found me working in a laundry facility in Queens. They offered me money and documents and a future. I said yes because I had nothing else to say yes to." The Whitmore operation was planned for over a year before it was executed. David Sterling was compromised through his gambling debts. He approved my false identity in exchange for having his debts cleared. His heart attack was genuine, but Ashworth did not mourn him. He had served his purpose. I was not supposed to be the one who administered the poison. My role was intelligence only: schedules and routines and vulnerabilities. The courier was supposed to be the one who entered the bedroom. But the courier was delayed at the Canadian border and the window was closing. Ashworth called me directly and told me I had to do it myself. I had never killed anyone before. I did not want to start with Edward Whitmore. But I had been inside Ashworth's organization for 14 years, and I knew what happened to people who refused orders. I did what I was told because I was afraid not to. I did not know about Clara Johnson. No one knew about Clara Johnson. She was a housekeeper. She was invisible. She was not supposed to be a factor in any of the planning. When she identified the toxin and saved Edward Whitmore's life, I knew immediately that Ashworth would never forgive the failure. I ran because I was terrified, not of the police, of him. The USB drive contains 14 years of records, financial transactions, offshore accounts, names of other operatives placed inside other households and corporations, evidence of 3 other attempted poisonings against business rivals in the last decade, evidence of 1 successful poisoning in London in 2017. The victim was a shipping executive named Marcus Webb who had crossed Ashworth in a trade negotiation. His death was ruled a heart attack. It was not a heart attack. If you are reading this, I am already dead. Either I killed myself before Ashworth's people could reach me, or they reached me first and made it look like I killed myself. Either way, the outcome is the same. I am writing this letter in a motel room outside Newark, and I am more tired than I have ever been in my entire life. I have spent 14 years being afraid of a man who never once looked me in the eye. He used me. He used all of us. He will use more people after I am gone, unless someone stops him. The photograph in the envelope is the only evidence of direct contact between Richard Ashworth and myself. It was taken at a charity gala in Manhattan 6 years ago. I was there as part of the catering staff. He did not know my face. His handlers kept the operational layers separate for exactly this reason. But I made sure to stand close enough to be in the frame. I wanted proof that we had been in the same room. I did not know when I would need it. I just knew that someday I would. My only request is this: find the families of the people Ashworth has killed and tell them the truth. They deserve to know that their loved ones did not die of heart attacks and strokes and accidents. They were murdered by a man who decided their lives were less valuable than his business interests. Tell them someone finally admitted what happened. Tell them someone finally said it out loud. I am sorry for what I did to Edward Whitmore. I am sorry for the terror I caused his family. I am sorry for every choice I made from the moment I said yes to Richard Ashworth's people 14 years ago. I was afraid, and I was alone, and I made the wrong choice every single time someone offered me a way out. I do not expect forgiveness. I do not deserve it. I only hope this letter and the evidence on the USB drive are enough to finish what Clara Johnson started. She saw what no one else saw. She spoke when everyone else was silent. She is the reason I am writing this letter instead of carrying another secret to my grave. Tell her thank you. Tell her Mama Ifoma would be proud of her. Rossi lowered the letter. The parking lot was completely silent. Even the trucks on the distant interstate seemed to have paused. The forensic technicians had stopped working. The uniformed officers had stopped talking. Everyone was standing in the glow of the flickering neon sign, holding their breath. She left us everything, Rossi said quietly. 14 years of records, 3 attempted poisonings, 1 successful murder, names and accounts and evidence. She gave us Richard Ashworth on a silver platter. Clara stood motionless beside the silver Camry. The woman inside had been her enemy for 6 days. But the letter in Rossi's hand had been written by a woman who had been a prisoner for 14 years. There was a difference between an enemy and a hostage, and Clara understood that difference better than most. She was not the enemy, Clara said. She was the weapon. Richard Ashworth pulled the trigger. He pulled it 14 years ago when he found a desperate woman in a laundry facility and turned her into a ghost. She never had a chance. Rossi looked at the USB drive in her hand. This is enough to arrest him, tonight, right now. I can have a warrant within the hour and a tactical team at his residence by dawn. Do it, Clara said, but I want to be there when he is arrested. I want him to see my face. I want him to know that the invisible housekeeper is the reason his 30-year plan collapsed. Rossi considered the request for a long moment. Then she nodded once. You have earned that right, but you stay in the vehicle until the scene is secure, no exceptions. The sun was beginning to rise over Newark as they drove back toward the highway. Behind them, the silver Camry was being loaded onto a flatbed truck. The diner's neon sign flickered one last time and then went dark. Somewhere inside the envelope in Rossi's hand was a photograph of Richard Ashworth standing next to a woman whose real name he had never bothered to learn. He had spent 30 years destroying rivals and 14 years controlling operatives and 9 years plotting the death of Edward Whitmore. He had built an empire on secrets and fear and the assumption that no one was paying attention. He had never met Clara May Johnson. They arrested Richard Ashworth at his estate in Bedford Hills at 6:15 in the morning. The tactical team moved through the front gate and across the manicured lawn and through the marble entrance of a mansion that made the Whitmore estate look modest. Ashworth was in his dining room eating breakfast alone at a table that seated 24. He was wearing a silk robe and reading the Financial Times. He did not run. He did not resist. He looked up at the officers with the calm expression of a man who had spent 40 years believing the rules did not apply to him, and was genuinely surprised to discover they finally did. Detective Rossi read him his rights while a federal prosecutor from the Southern District of New York stood beside her holding the USB drive that Anya Volkov had left in her glove compartment. The charges were conspiracy to commit murder, multiple counts, domestic and international, additional charges for identity fraud and obstruction of justice and money laundering and racketeering. The federal prosecutor read each charge aloud in a steady voice, while Ashworth listened without any visible emotion. Clara watched from the back of Rossi's vehicle as they led Richard Ashworth out of his mansion in handcuffs. He was 73 years old. He had white hair and a patrician face and the bearing of a man who had attended all the right schools and belonged to all the right clubs and had never in his life been told that he could not have something he wanted. As they walked him past the police cruisers, he looked up and saw Clara sitting in the back seat of Rossi's car. He stopped walking. The officers on either side of him tensed, but Ashworth did not try to run. He simply stood there staring at Clara through the window with an expression that was not anger, and not fear, and not even curiosity. It was confusion, genuine confusion, the look of a man who had calculated every variable except one. "You," he said. His voice was muffled through the glass, but Clara could read his lips. "You are the housekeeper." Clara did not look away. She did not blink. She had been invisible for 12 years, and this man had never seen her and never would have seen her if his 30-year plan had not collapsed because of a capful of bleach and a woman who paid attention. "Yes," she said, "I am the housekeeper." Ashworth stared at her for 3 more seconds. Then the officers pulled him forward and pushed him into the back of a waiting police van. The door slammed shut. The van pulled away down the long gravel driveway. Richard Ashworth was gone. The empire he had built on secrets and fear and the assumption that no one was paying attention was over. The trial lasted 11 weeks. It was covered by every major news network in the world. The phrase "invisible housekeeper" appeared in headlines from New York to London to Tokyo. Clara May Johnson became a name that people recognized. She gave testimony on the 4th day of the trial, wearing a simple blue dress that Victoria had bought for her. She answered every question from the prosecution with the same quiet precision she had used to identify the needle mark on Edward Whitmore's wrist. She described the bleach test and the lilies and the dark blue courier van and the 9 years Margaret Chan had spent inside the Whitmore mansion pretending to be someone she was not. When the defense attorney tried to undermine her testimony by pointing out that she had no formal investigative training, Clara looked at him with the same dark eyes that had seen everything everyone else had missed. "I have been trained to notice details," she said. "That is what makes a good housekeeper. It also turns out to be what makes a good investigator. The difference is that housekeepers are paid less and thanked less often. But we see everything. We always have." The courtroom was silent. The defense attorney had no further questions. The USB drive contained exactly what Anya Volkov had promised. 14 years of financial records, names of operatives placed inside 17 different households and corporations across 6 countries. Evidence of the successful poisoning of Marcus Webb in London in 2017. The Webb family was notified privately before the information became public. They held a press conference on the steps of their solicitor's office in Mayfair. Marcus Webb's widow read a statement that quoted directly from Anya Volkov's letter. Someone finally admitted what happened. Someone finally said it out loud. Richard Ashworth was convicted on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder, identity fraud, obstruction of justice, money laundering, racketeering. The judge sentenced him to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. He was 73 years old. He would die inside a cell with a view of nothing. The Wall Street Journal ran the same headline Edward Whitmore had once framed and hung in his study. "Richard Ashworth is the only man in the world I genuinely despise." Beneath it was a new subheading, "And now he will spend the rest of his life behind bars because of a housekeeper." Edward Whitmore recovered, not completely. The colchicine had damaged his liver and his kidneys and his heart. He would need medication for the rest of his life, and his doctors estimated he had lost perhaps 5 years he might otherwise have had. But he was alive. He was sitting up in bed and arguing with his newspaper again and telling anyone who would listen about the woman in the gray uniform who had refused to watch him die. He called Clara to his bedroom on the morning after the trial ended. The room had been restored to its original state. The water glass and the lilies were gone. The forensic tape had been removed from the doorframe. but the memory of that night hung in the air like the echo of a bell that had stopped ringing. "Victoria tells me you refused a title and a salary," Edward said. His voice was weaker than it had been before the poisoning, but the sharpness was still there, the intelligence, the wit. "She offered you anything you wanted, and you asked only to find Margaret Chen's real family." "Yes," Clara said. "Why?" "Because titles do not interest me, and money is not what I came here for. I came to this country as a widow with nothing, and I found work cleaning floors in a mansion. For 12 years I was invisible. I accepted that. I made peace with it. But Anya Volkov was invisible too. She was invisible in a laundry facility in Queens when Richard Ashworth found her and turned her into a ghost. I could have ended up like her. Anyone could have ended up like her. The only difference between us is that someone gave me Mama Ephioma and someone gave her Richard Ashworth." Clara paused. "I wanted to find her family because she deserved at least one person in the world who knew who she really was. Not the fake name or the fake identity or the woman who tried to poison you. The real person underneath all of that. The person she was before Ashworth destroyed her." Edward Whitmore looked at Clara for a long moment. His eyes were old and tired and had seen too much, but they were also clear, clearer than they had been in years. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever met," he said, "and I have met presidents." "I am a housekeeper," Clara said. "I am a housekeeper who paid attention. That is all." "That is everything," Edward said. 3 months after the trial ended, Clara stood in a cemetery outside St. Petersburg. It was winter in Russia. The ground was frozen and the sky was the color of iron. Beside her stood a woman named Irina Volkova, who was 67 years old and had been told 2 weeks ago that her daughter had been living under a false identity in the United States for 20 years. Anya Volkov's real mother. The Whitmore family had hired a team of private investigators to trace Anya's real identity back to its source. It had taken months, false documents and dead ends, and records that led nowhere. But eventually, they found a birth certificate in a municipal archive in St. Petersburg. Anya Irina Volkova, born March 14th. Mother, Irina Volkova. Father, unknown. The trail had gone cold when Anya was 21 and left for the United States on a student visa. After that, there was nothing, no letters, no phone calls, no record of any contact with her mother for 2 decades. Irina Volkova stood next to Clara in the frozen cemetery, holding a single white rose. Her face was lined and old, and her eyes had been crying for 2 weeks. But she was standing straight. She was standing straight because someone had finally told her the truth about what happened to her daughter. "She wrote about you in her letter," Clara said. "She did not mention you by name, but she wrote that someone, somewhere, was missing her. Someone did not know what happened to the person she used to be. She was talking about you. Even at the end, she was thinking about you." Irina did not speak for a long moment. The wind moved through the bare branches of the cemetery trees. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell was ringing. "I knew something was wrong," Irina said finally. "When she stopped writing, when the letters stopped coming, I knew something terrible had happened to my daughter. I told the police. I told the embassy. No one believed me. They said she had probably started a new life and forgotten about her old one. They said young people do that sometimes and it does not mean anything." She looked at Clara. "But I knew. A mother always knows." "Richard Ashworth took 20 years of her life," Clara said. "He took her name and her identity and her future. But he did not take her conscience. At the very end, she chose to do the right thing. She left behind the evidence that brought him down. She wrote a letter that told the world who she really was. She did not die as Margaret Chen. She died as Anya Volkov, and that matters." Irina placed the white rose at the base of a small stone marker that had been installed 2 days earlier. It bore her daughter's real name and her real birth date and a single line in Russian that translated to, "She told the truth at last." "I forgive her," Irina said. "Whatever she did in those 20 years, I forgive her. She was my daughter. She will always be my daughter. Nothing Richard Ashworth did can change that." Clara stood in the frozen cemetery and watched a mother forgive her dead daughter. The wind was cold, and the sky was gray, and the world was full of broken things that could never be fully repaired. But something had been repaired in this moment, something small but real. A thread that had been severed 20 years ago had been tied back together, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Clara Mae Johnson returned to the United States in the spring. She had been offered positions at 3 different hospitals and 2 private medical practices and 1 university that wanted her to teach a course on diagnostic observation. She accepted a position at a community health clinic in Bridgeport, Connecticut, that served mostly immigrant families who could not afford private care. The salary was modest, the hours were long, the patients were grateful and frightened and sometimes unable to explain their symptoms in English. Clara understood them perfectly. Victoria Whitmore visited the clinic one afternoon in May. She walked through the waiting room in a suit that cost more than the clinic's annual operating budget and found Clara in a small examination room taking the blood pressure of an elderly Guatemalan woman who spoke no English at all. "I wanted to see where you ended up," Victoria said. Clara finished taking the blood pressure reading and wrote something in the patient's chart. Then she turned to face Victoria. "This is where I belong, not in a mansion in Greenwich, not on a lecture stage at a university. Here, with people who are invisible the way I used to be invisible. People who need someone to pay attention." Victoria was quiet for a moment. She looked around the small examination room. The peeling paint and the old equipment and the window that looked out onto a parking lot full of potholes. It was a long way from the marble hallways of the Whitmore estate. But Clara looked more at peace than Victoria had ever seen her. "Father wants to endow the clinic," Victoria said. "New equipment, expanded facilities, a full-time staff of 6 instead of 2. He wants to name it after you, the Clara Johnson Community Health Center." Clara considered this. She thought about Edward Whitmore sitting in his bedroom reading the Wall Street Journal aloud. She thought about Mama Ifeoma teaching her to see what everyone else missed. She thought about Anya Volkov writing a confession in a motel room outside Newark. She thought about Irina Volkova placing a white rose on her daughter's grave. "Tell your father I accept the endowment, but not the name," Clara said. "Name it after Mama Ifeoma, the Ifeoma Adebayo Community Health Center. She is the reason any of this happened. She is the one who taught me to pay attention. The name should be hers." Victoria smiled. It was a tired smile, but a genuine one. "I will tell him. He will argue with you about it for at least 6 months. He loves arguing almost as much as he loves winning." "I know," Clara said. "I have been listening to him argue with his newspaper for 12 years. The Ifeoma Adebayo Community Health Center opened in Bridgeport, Connecticut on the first day of autumn. Edward Whitmore attended the ceremony in a wheelchair with an oxygen tank hooked to the back and a blanket across his lap. He was frailer than he had been before the poisoning, but his eyes were still sharp and his voice was still strong. And when he spoke to the gathered crowd, he did not talk about the endowment or the Whitmore family legacy or any of the things people expected a billionaire to talk about at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. "I almost died because of lilies," Edward said. "Lilies. A flower that has been growing on this planet for millions of years. A flower that was here before the dinosaurs and will be here after all of us are gone. And I almost died because I was allergic to it, and no one in my family knew." He paused. But one person knew. One person noticed that the lilies were not from the regular florist. One person saw a needle mark on my wrist that was too precise to be an accident. One person remembered a lesson she learned from a nurse in a hospital in Lagos 23 years ago. And that one person saved my life. He looked at Clara standing near the back of the crowd in a simple blue dress with her hands folded in front of her. "Clara Mae Johnson was my housekeeper for 12 years. I never spoke to her directly in all that time, not once. She cleaned my floors and changed my bed sheets, and I never learned her name until the night she refused to let me die. I have spent my entire life building an empire, and I was too busy to notice the woman who was standing right in front of me." He paused again. His voice was shaking slightly. "I am not too busy anymore. None of us should be too busy anymore. Pay attention to the people in your life. Pay attention to the invisible ones. Pay attention to the housekeepers and the drivers and the laundry workers and the people who clean your offices at night. They see everything, and one day what they see might save your life." The crowd applauded. Clara did not applaud. She was looking at Edward Whitmore and thinking about all the mornings she had listened to him argue with his newspaper. She had never expected him to see her. She had made peace with invisibility a long time ago. But being seen was not as frightening as she had thought it would be. Being seen was not a burden. It was a door opening into a room she had never been allowed to enter before. Clara May Johnson worked at the clinic for the rest of her career. She trained 2 generations of nurses and community health workers in the art of paying attention. She taught them to look at the room and not just the chart. She taught them to notice the flowers and the water glass and the needle mark on the wrist. She taught them that diagnosis begins with observation, and observation begins with the willingness to see what everyone else has overlooked. She never remarried. She never returned to Nigeria except for one visit to lay flowers on Mama Ifeoma's grave. She lived in a small apartment above the clinic, and she walked to work every morning at 6 o'clock, and she never stopped paying attention. Not to the patients, not to the staff, not to the small details that told the real story hidden beneath the surface of things. She died at the age of 79 on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The clinic closed for 3 days. The New York Times ran an obituary that called her the most influential diagnostician of her generation. The Wall Street Journal ran a piece that described her as the housekeeper who brought down a billionaire. Edward Whitmore had died 6 years earlier, but his children attended the funeral. All 3 of them, Victoria and Charles and Eleanor. They sat together in the same row, and for the first time in 20 years, they did not argue about anything. The funeral was held at a small church in Bridgeport. The pastor spoke about the power of small things, the power of paying attention, the power of a single person who refuses to look away. When the service ended, a woman nobody recognized stood up and walked to the front of the church. She was young and black and wore a nurse's uniform with the name tag Ifeoma stitched across the pocket. "My name is Ifeoma Okonkwo," she said. "I was named after a nurse who taught Clara Johnson everything she knew. I grew up in Lagos, and I moved to the United States because I heard the story of a Nigerian housekeeper who saved a billionaire's life by paying attention to the details everyone else ignored. I became a nurse because of Clara Johnson, and I have spent my entire career trying to see the world the way she saw it." She paused. "Mama Ifeoma taught Clara to observe. Clara taught the world, and now I am here because the chain never ends. One person pays attention and teaches another person to pay attention, and that person teaches another. That is how the world changes. Not through grand gestures, through small acts of observation repeated across generations." She looked at Clara's casket. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for seeing what no one else could see. Thank you for refusing to be invisible when the world tried to make you invisible. Thank you for proving that a housekeeper can change the course of history." She paused one final time. "We see you, Clara May Johnson. We have always seen you, and we always will."